increase was carefully timed for 2 years. That means it's going to come up during the next election. Okay, that's the sunset technique again. Then everybody knows that during an election, nobody's going to call for an increase in the payroll tax. So therefore, it'll become permanent. And if it becomes permanent, that has a great consequence. It helps defund Social Security. The Social Security is actually in very good shape, and despite what you read in the press, it contributes zero to the deficit. And furthermore, it's well funded for a long time to come. But if you defund it, then it'll be in trouble. And there's a standard technique of privatization used all the time. It's being used right now in public education. Maggie Thatcher used it in England when she wanted to privatize the railroads. Defund something, and then it stops working, and then you have a clamor about making it work, so you have to privatize it. Absolutely standard and routine. I mean, it takes genius not to see it. So the idea is defund Social Security, then it'll be in trouble, then we'll have to privatize it. That's a huge bonanza for Wall Street. Trillions of dollars of capital are going to go into the hands of financial managers to play games with, make huge profits, and when they get in trouble, as they will, get bailed out. Of course, it also substantially increases insecurity, but that doesn't affect the wealthy, certainly not the super rich. Peter Peterson, billionaire, who's been heading the campaign to destroy Social Security for years, and one of his standard lines is, "I don't rely on Social Security." That's true if you're a billionaire, but for most people it's the means of survival, especially now that their wealth has collapsed after the fake wealth of the housing bubble burst. But there are more reasons, apart from the fact that Social Security helps the middle class and the working people and not the wealthy, there's another reason for trying to get rid of it. It's based on a very dangerous principle, Social Security. It's based on a principle of solidarity and sympathy. The Social Security is based on the principle that you care if a disabled widow across town is starving. And you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to gain wealth forgetting all but self, the new spirit of the age 150 years ago, and not care about other people. And that's drilled into people's heads from childhood. And Social Security stands as in opposition to that. And so do public schools. The public schools are based on the principle that even if you don't have children in the school, you care whether the kids go to school. So therefore, there should be a good education for them. And that, again, is no good. Public schools don't mean a thing to wealthy people, but they do mean a lot to the population. And that spirit of solidarity and sympathy, that's quite dangerous. That could spread and lead to other consequences. Well, these are major developments right now. They're all part of a systematic campaign of quite bitter class war, which has many aspects. In fact, it's happening in many ways which aren't visible. Actually, the tax cuts for the rich are also not very visible. One of the ways that it's being carried out is by changing the rules of corporate governance. Now, those are established by the government. Corporations are state-created artificial entities, and the government sets the rules of corporate governance. They've been changed substantially in the United States, not in other countries. So, for example, chief executives are now permitted, under the new rules, to select the boards that determine their salaries. Okay. Doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going to happen from that. There's techniques have been devised by the government to allow executives to get stock options instead of direct pay. That's a way of concealing the huge giveaway to the super rich. There were efforts in the early 90s by government agencies to try to at least get some transparency into that, but Congress beat them down. Deregulation has been going on since the late 70s, and that gives enormous benefits to corporate management. It's very harmful to the population. In fact, we can see that. During the period when the New Deal regulations were in force, there weren't any financial crises, 50s and 60s. Since deregulation began, there's been a series of regular financial crises, right through the Reagan years, on and the Clinton year, big tech bubble, and on, of course, right now is the worst of them. They keep getting worse. Each one's worse. There are direct consequences of eliminating the kind of regulation that would keep a financial system functioning. But it doesn't really matter if they get worse and worse, because the rich make out fine. They get bailed out each time. So the trick is the public pays the costs and the rich make the benefits. It's a wonderful system. One part of this, everyone knows about the bailouts. They're visible and they create a lot of anger, but they're the least of it. Much more significant than that was the Treasury and the Fed giving very cheap credit, making cheap credit available to collapsing the corporations and banks, and plenty of other devices. They far outweigh the TARP subsidy. There's also a crucial government insurance policy. The government insures big corporations and banks against failure. There's a name for that. It's called too big to fail. That means if you're a big bank, or you're Goldman Sachs or Citigroup or something like that, you know you're not going to fail, because if you do, the taxpayer's going to come in and bail you out. Well, that creates very perverse incentives. It means you should, in fact, take major risks, make a lot of money, and when they collapse, as risky transactions do, don't worry about it. Taxpayer will come in and fill your pockets. Exactly what's happening. Now bigger than ever. Just take a look at the bonuses. Well, these developments are sometimes often in fact called just inexorable processes, the result of globalization, new technology, and so on. That can't be true. Europe lives in the same economy that the United States does, but government policies there are completely different in all the respects I mentioned. Take a look at the European countries. Taxes have the traditional role. They reduce inequality, maybe not by much, but at least they target inequality. Here it used to be that way here too. Now it's the opposite. The tax system increases inequality and is carefully designed to do so, and it's inequality at the very extreme end. CEOs, bank managers, and so on. That's pretty dramatic. These guys also happen to be the main funders of elections. Well, as I mentioned, the elections have become PR extravaganzas, and campaign managers are not shy about it. They say quite openly that the campaigns must feature, they have to focus on personalities, on rhetoric, and not on issues. And polls show that recent elections, the public is unaware of the stand of the parties on issues. Now, that's not because they're ignorant or unconcerned. It's because a very careful effort is made to keep the issues out of the picture. You're supposed to get the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders out of politics, after all. And there's a particular reason for that, is that there's a tremendous disconnect between policies and public opinion. So that's another reason for keeping issues and policies out of the public eye. Now, actually, it's more nuanced than that. Now, there have been some careful studies of Senate votes. And Senate votes, it turns out, are responsive to a part of the public, namely the very rich. So the top third, if you take a look at the top third of the income distribution, senatorial votes kind of correlate reasonably well with opinion. overwhelmingly with the very top. You take the middle third, there's no correlation. You take the bottom third, there is a correlation, but it's negative. That means votes are counter to the wishes of the constituency. Well, again, makes sense within class war. Campaign spending is now so extravagant that elections are basically bought by private concentrations of capital. As you may know, Obama in 2008, after the election, won a prize from the advertising industry for the best marketing campaign of 2008, beat out Apple Computer. If you look at the business press, which again is not shy, executives were just euphoric. They said, we've been selling candidates like toothpaste ever since Reagan. This is the greatest achievement we've ever had. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms, new styles and so on. And yeah, that makes good sense. I mentioned that the Republicans have just given up being a traditional political party. I mean, simply deep in the pockets of the very rich in the business sector. The moderate Republicans of the past are now the Democrats. And they're not far behind. So take, say, Obama again. The main source of his funding in the 2008 election, the concentrated funding, was financial institutions, very powerful in the economy now. And they preferred him to McCain. And that sort of carried him over, if you look closely. And they expected to be rewarded. It's the way politics works. And they were. As soon as Obama picked a financial team, economic team, to deal with the financial crisis that the financial institutions had created, he picked their people right across the board. All the Robert Rubin group, straight out of Citigroup, Larry Summers, the high priest of deregulation, Timothy Geithner of the New York Stock Exchange, who had been kind of supervising the shenanigans of the housing bubble and the rest, and right along the line. Now, there was actually one exception, Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was Treasury Secretary under Reagan, but the spectrum has shifted so far to the right so that he's now the liberal in the government. He was the one person there who was calling seriously for financial regulation. And I stress was, because he's just been kicked out. Just a couple of days ago, Volcker was replaced by Jeffrey Immelt, the head of General Electric. Obama was praised for that. Shows he's moving toward the center, meaning the far right, and becoming more business friendly, even more than before. What was the reason for, there was good reason for getting rid of Volcker. Financial institutions didn't like him. He was calling for regulation, limited, but some. But why pick Immelt? Well, actually, that's discussed in the business press. The world's leading business daily, the London Financial Times, points out that Mr. Immelt's appointment was applauded by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the biggest lobbying group, which has been among the president's harshest critics and funded many Republicans who ran against Democrats in the November election. Well, we don't want that to happen again, so we'll get them on our side. Thomas Ferguson, who I mentioned before, the main specialist on campaign funding, he says it more straight out. He said, what we actually have here is the disappearance from the scene of the best known and most visible critic of the excesses of the financial sector, and his replacement by the sitting CEO of a company that is heavily dependent on government aid of all sorts, including diplomatic assistance to invest more in China, and in fact, straight bailouts. This is not about jobs, he continues, but political money. The White House knows that after the Citizens United case year ago in the Supreme Court.